looking at some new presentations that I've done put together over the last year, and we're going to divide it into 4 segments. We're going to start with 2 segments on the forehand return in pro tennis. We'll do one having to do with classical returns with Federer, and then a second one on more extreme returns, looking at footage of Djokovic and Nadal. And then we're going to move on, and you guys are going to get a preview of the presentation I'm going to do at the TTC at the Open on backhand stances. And it's surprising. When we look at the footage, I think you're going to be shocked when we see that in pro tennis for both the two-hander and the one-hander, the preference for stance is the exact opposite of the forehand. Extreme closed stance, okay? Although we see all the variations, the preference is for the closed stance. I don't think this has really been looked at and understood before, and I'm going to give you some reasons why I think this is happening. And interestingly, I think what we're going to see is the advantages for the backhand pro closed stance are actually similar to the open stance advantages on the forehand. So I think you'll be interested to see how that works. It may not be something that 90% of all club players should teach, but I think should learn. But I think it's important to see what's happening at the level of the pro game. And then in the last segment, we'll move on and we'll do something with the serve. Something that I actually put together for Swen Gronfeld having to do with Sharapova's serve. And we're going to take a look at it in high-speed footage and see there's been a lot of theories about why she's hitting all her double faults. This and that is wrong with her serve. I'm going to give you my take on that, compare it to some of the men players, and then segue into looking at the complexities of the upward swing in tennis on the serve. So we'll get started with the classical forehand returns. These returns we're going to look at are filmed at a frame rate of 250 and 500 frames a second. And we're going to see a lot of things that are invisible to the naked eye. And I wanted to ask you guys some things. Am I having a stroke? Or I wanted to ask you guys some things about what you know about the capabilities of the human eye to see what happens in tennis strokes. How fast equivalently does the human eye actually film when we're looking with our naked eye? Does anybody know?
20 to 25 a second.
There you go. About 20 to 25 frames a second, okay? And how long is the ball on the strings?
2,000 a second.
2 to 4 milliseconds, right? So, the reality of it is, and Vic Braden was the first person to ever say this, nobody's ever really, quote, seen another human being hit a tennis ball. That event happens 10 to 20 times too fast for your eye to register a clear image, okay? And that tells you all you need to know right there about why there's so much disagreement, you know, across the spectrum of all the strokes between knowledgeable, passionate people. So what does high-speed video do? Okay, it allows us to actually go inside these invisible events, okay, invisible to the human eye. Video at 250 frames a second will have the ball on the strings in every event, okay? Typical, and you see more high-speed video now in the replays in tennis on television, but standard video broadcast cameras still film at 30 frames a second. So to really see what's happening, you need the specialized cameras, and that's what we're going to use to look at the strokes. It's critical if you really want to see what's happening inside these moments, and you know, helpful in all the aspects of the stroke, even the super fast motions right around the contact. That's critical, but it's very helpful in all the other dimensions as well. So, like I said, we're gonna look at the forehand return first, and we're going to look at the classical shots, and we're gonna see that there is no such thing as, quote, the forehand return, okay? We're gonna see that the elements differ from player to player, and also the players themselves combine the elements in different ways. And we'll see some differences from the ground strokes that I think you're gonna find surprising. So, is it as dark as it's gonna get?
They just lighten it up a little bit. You want me to dark? You're
All
gonna have to turn the projector on too.
Let's see what it looks like. Oh, turn it on?
It may have gone off on you.
Did it come off? Let's find out.
No, it's good.
There we go. Okay, so we know who that guy is. What we're going to watch here is just a fairly typical forehand return for him when he's standing in. And really, that shot right there, you couldn't find a better example of a compact forehand drive. And what that means is, by, quote, modern standards, he is hitting the ball quite a bit flatter compared to the ground strokes. The first spin studies, the shot spot can read spin now. The first spin studies ever done were at the Open in '97, when these high-speed cameras really first became applicable to sports. And what we saw then, when we did that first study, was that the spin rates in pro tennis were very surprising. That the top players, say Sampras and Agassi on their forehands, were hitting forehands with close to 2,000 RPM of spin. So if you think about that, from the time the ball leaves their racket till it gets to your racket, a little more than a little more than a second, that ball's turning over, say, 30 times. 1,000 turned over 30 times, right? In the modern game, that's almost double, okay? Nadal averaging 3,300 RPMs of spin. We've measured them up to close to 5,000 RPM. In that 1 second, try to visualize the ball turning over 60 times. It's almost impossible to imagine. 1,060 times, right? So, when we look at the returns, we see something pretty different. What we see is that the spin levels on the returns by a player like Federer are lower than the original spin rates on the ground strokes from the Open in '97. Whereas Roger doesn't hit as much spin on his forehand as Nadal, maybe 20% less on average, maybe 2,700 RPM. Note that's still 20% more than Sampras and Agassi, right? On his returns, he's hitting between 600 and 1,400 RPM, averaging a little bit under 1,000. So on this return, typically he's averaging about a third or a little bit more of the spin that he hits on his ground strokes. On his second, that's a first serve return. On his second serve return, he's hitting about 1,500, but that's still only a little bit more than half. When we go to Nadal and Djokovic, we'll see those values are higher. So that's a beautiful return. Now let's see if we can start to break it down into the components. And let's start with the grips, all right? I got a couple of questions before the talk about this. We're going to talk about that recovery step in the deuce court too. But let's look at the grips. Okay, there's one really good shot of it, right? If you look at his grip, that is what I would call a modern Eastern forehand grip, okay? Here's another look at it. Okay. Now, what is that grip exactly, and how does it differ, that's where I want to pause it, from his regular forehand grip. So we know about the bevels, right? Starting on the top, that's bevel 1, 2, 3. Roger on his regular forehand is what I would call a 3-4. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. The index knuckle is about on 3, and then the heel pad has slid down to the edge between 3 and 4. Sometimes he's up a little higher, but in general, it's a very mild semi-western grip. It's hard to tell because part of his hand is off the handle too, right? So in the modern game, that's a very conservative grip. Who are other players that have similar grips? Del Potro, Joe Willie.
Definitely.
Right. So on his return, how does that differ? He's up a little higher, okay? Now, don't be confused by his ready position because he waits partially shifted towards the backhand, right? But when he hits the actual return, his hand is flat behind the strings, just the old Eastern shake hands grip that we saw. What does that mean for the type of height that he would like to hit on his returns? Low, right? He needs to stand in to hit with that grip, and it's harder for him when the ball is high. Like on that ball. So now let's look at the court position. And that right there is pretty typical. He typically stands, 2, maybe sometimes 4 feet behind the baseline on the first serve. And on the second serve, he moves further in. Sometimes he starts behind the baseline on the second serve and then takes that extra step up before the split, okay? And this is related to the timing, but it's critical also to the contact height because he's taking the returns on the rise, and it means that he controls the contact height by keeping the ball below shoulder level, right? So there's the split. Now notice when he lands that super wide base and that he typically lands with both feet pointing directly forward, okay? We're going to see some variations in that when we get to Nadal, but he tends to land like that. Some players will actually be starting their unit turn at that point, okay? You think Roger's strong in his legs? Okay, so now let's look at the start of the turn. There's one where he's stepping up first. Notice the landing is the same with the toes square. Now look what happens next. So his unit turn typically is with what I would call pivot steps, right? He's not picking up his foot, right? He's swiveling both his feet. And if you look at, let me grab my pointer here. If you look at his outside foot or his left foot, look how much it's staying. Well, I thought
It's in the pocket. Sorry, I put it back in the pocket.
Oh, you put it somewhere? Pat's helping me out here. That one right there. Thank you, sir. Look how this foot is staying in place. And when we start to talk about when we compare the backhands, we'll see that typically in the forehand ground stroke, this foot comes further up. So there is a double pivot step, right? He's setting up there in what you would call a fully open stance. Here's another look at it. Now, let's see what happens with the body rotation in combination with that step. So this is pretty typical, okay? Look that the feet have rotated, a little bit less on this one. Look at the angle of the body. Typically, it's rotated 30 degrees, maybe 45. We'll see on some he goes even further. Now, if you were to say to a student, take your racket back, would that be correct? Yes, take your racket back early, but the question is how? It's mainly happening here through this unitary body turn, and it's relatively little motion independently with the arms. So just like we've seen over the years on the ground strokes, the preparation of the racket, this whole idea of taking the racket back early is correct, but it needs to be associated with the body turn to be in accordance with the way the top players do it. Now, here's something really interesting. Look at that move right there, okay? If you look at his actual backswing after the body turn, he does not take the racket up. Look that the racket does two things. It moves back, and it moves also to the outside, okay? Have any of you guys seen Rick Macy's presentations on this, the outside backswing? Have you seen or read any of the work done by Brian Gordon, who's the person that really figured this out? Why is that? We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But the outside backswing leads to something called the flip in the start of the forward swing, all right? So let's just watch how this happens. There's the turn. You can see he goes further on this one. That's about the most you'll see in turn. Now, let's watch what happens next. There's that move to the outside. Now watch. So that's interesting, isn't it? Okay. This is something that I didn't really understand until I got a chance to work. Are you guys familiar with the work of Brian Gordon? He's in Florida. He's working with Macy now. This guy is taking the work that I'm doing and adding the dimension of quantitative numbers to it, okay? And so he's able to actually, we can put that picture up on the screen and he can give you the measurements, the distances, the speed. So if we look at this move, right, we've got those pivot steps, shoulder turn, racket goes straight back into the outside. Notice the butt of the racket does not square up on this return. We'll see it's different with Djokovic and Nadal. It's outside, right? Now, why is that, okay? I'm not a biomechanist, but I believe what those guys are telling me. This position is putting a pre-stretch in the shoulder, right? That is actually turbocharging, as Brian likes to say, the forward swing. So from this position, what happens is the shoulder rotates back. That's the pre-stretch. And from there, the shoulder is able to generate 25, maybe more % natural force, okay? So if you've ever wondered why players like Federer or Agassi, who has a similar move, can hit these gigantic returns on the compact swings, this is part of the reason.
John, can we ask a question?
Yeah.
So you're saying the racket butt cap is outside the ball or the face?
You tell me. I mean, the face is outside.
Okay.
Look where that butt cap's going. I would say that's inside, right? What you're seeing is the shoulders aren't turning as much, the racket is not going up, okay? And it's not squaring up to the ball, okay? And on the return, this is creating, you wanna look at the flip again? Watch this little move right here. Here's the flip. We can talk a little bit more about the check once there. So the outside backswing, right, is going to go to the outside. Look at the angles, right? This angle is going to be like 30-ish, maybe 45, right? Okay. The racket head is also going to be slightly closed, a slight dog path, right? So this then leads to this. That's the pre-stretch that turbocharges the shoulder.
I got a quick question. Are
Yeah.
there any gender differences? Because I know that there's been some stuff on the web, you know, the WTA versus the ATP forehand and breaking the plane. Is there any reason a female can't learn?
Boy, you're asking the $64 question, and you'll find people that will argue passionately on both sides of that. In general, what you're seeing on the forehand is a move towards convergence, okay? Interestingly, the first female player to do it, Henin, okay?
Yeah.
Okay? Now, I happen to know something about that because when we did our first high-speed filming in '97 of Agassi, among others, you know who was the first person in line to get that footage? Carlos Rodriguez, okay? So, and I'm gonna do, I've been shying away from doing this, but I'm gonna come clean on it. I've got a lot of footage of Justine, say in 2002 at Indian Wells, and her forehand is a mess then, okay? So Carlos took Agassi and used him as a model. So it's obvious, and she had a great forehand. It's obvious that women can do it, okay? But you see players with good forehands that don't do it. Kvitova, right, for example. So is it better, maybe from the biomechanical point of view, assuming you can do it? Can every player do it and generate the same kind of pre-stretch? I don't know. You know, if Brian was here, he'd be shaking his head, twitching, because, you know, he would say that anybody can learn, and that's what they teach at Macy's. I've had other developmental coaches say, I tried that and my player couldn't break an egg with it, right? It's a very interesting question. So I think I sufficiently dodged the answer. Yeah.
I think that anybody can do it if they start early. Once they develop habits, it's hard to break them, especially when ball travels a little bit faster like here.
There you go. So, you know, that's, you very well might be right. So here it is again. Now that's starting to make sense, right? You see the outside backswing, and there's the flip.
John, can I ask a quick question, please?
Yes, sir.
Does he do that more because he has that sort of modern Eastern grip? Would it change if somebody had a semi-Western or a true semi or a full Western?
Yeah, we're gonna look. We're gonna look at that. You would tend to see it more characteristic of the more conservative grips. Okay. But the guys with the extreme grips who are going to hit extreme grip returns also tend to stay further back. But Djokovic will do this. He's probably the purest example of it. Yeah. Okay. So now.
But John, they're all doing it on regular ground strokes, aren't they?
Okay.
Or is that later?
Okay. Okay. To a great extent, yes. So we'll look at this a little bit more because before I set up the backhand stance thing, I've got some forehand grand stroke footage. But okay, so we're looking at this as the return. Here's the ground stroke version. The return's more. It's more outside. Some of the guys are bigger back here, but interestingly, they all get to this position where there's a mini dog path, right, and a big flip. So yes, that seems to be something that is, someone's laughing back there. Thoughts?
No, we just have different names for the dog path thing.
Yeah, right.
That's all it was.
Tapped on the nose. Yeah, whatever. You know, it's whatever you want to call it. That's, you know, become sort of the name for it. So yes, and you know, getting back to the other point, you're seeing the women start to move through that, but you know, let's see, Petra Kvitova won Wimbledon. I guess her forehand's pretty good, right? So now, let's look at the stance. Caught him in the middle there. We had basically a unit turn, a compact unit turn, an outside backswing, and that's followed by this. Watch the outside foot come across. The contact is somewhere in the middle of that step, and then there's the landing. So in the modern game, on the big serves, this may be the only way these guys actually can get to the ball. It's with a step in place, followed by, I'm getting ahead of myself there, followed by that diagonal cross step. And that's what, if you guys are familiar with the Australian David Bailey and his footwork, he calls that a power move, okay? You see that on the running forehand too. Now, that doesn't mean it's absolute. You know, when the ball, there's a lesser one, right? It could be more, it could be less depending on the ball. If the ball is directly in, he'll hit it basically from that open stance as well. Or going away like that. Now, let's go back and look at the actual forward swing, all right? We've been looking at the feet, but let's look at the same sequences and look at the swing. And you know what? This swing pattern right there, that finish, that'd be a pretty good classic Eastern finish. That sort of looks like what Robert Lansdorf taught Pete Sampras at age 8, right? So you can see there that he's coming out through the ball with the racket on edge. Wrist is staying in position, and there's the finish, right? Racket is basically straight up, very little wiper. Wrist is about eye level, and he's come with a hand across to about the left shoulder. So this is the classical, compact, take it on the rise, flat bullet return. So let's look at one other thing now. Hitting arm position. Okay, so Federer, Nadal, a few other players, Verdasco, Del Potro to some extent, all tend to hit most of their forehands with, you know, what I call the straight arm forehand with the elbow straight, right? And you see Fed try to hit his returns like that, but interestingly, he will also default into this double bend position with more elbow bend. So I think, you know, the interesting point here is, should you hit your return straight arm or double bend? I think you hit it with what you normally do. You know, if your player has a double bend, which is far more common and easier to control, then that's what you hit. Okay, if they do have a straight arm forearm, you know, maybe a lot of the returns are going to be with a straight arm, but you know, it can't be wrong. It can't be that bad if this guy is hitting so many of his returns with the double bend position. Okay, so now let me catch up with myself here for a second.